Hello, this is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Mnyaradzi and also known as Mutos. Welcome to the Connection Desk. We are into Acts chapter 20. Before we get into the actual text today, just a little recap of what happened in the previous chapter. We were in Ephesus and God used Paul in amazing ways. There were miraculous signs, extraordinary miraculous signs that God did while he was in Ephesus, and the whole province of Asia then heard the gospel. And after that time, towards the end of the time, after about maybe 2 to 3 years of ministry in that space, in that area, we then have this situation of Demetrius, the silversmith, who managed to get an uproar, a riot that happened in the land. And of course, Paul was actually defended by the city officials, and the disciples stopped him from going out to address the crowd because they could see that he was in danger. So we pick it up now from Acts chapter 20. And in Acts 20, we are continuing his story in Ephesus, but we're just ending the story in Ephesus, and we are moving on to the trip that he is now beginning to make on his way back to Jerusalem. But on his way back to Jerusalem, he goes via Macedonia, via Greece, and things like that. So let's read this where we are now. So in Acts chapter 20, and we are from verse 1 through to 12. When the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. He traveled through that area, speaking many words of encouragement to the people, and finally arrived in Greece, where he stayed 3 months, because the Jews made a plot against him just as he was about to sail for Syria. He decided to go back. Just as he was about to go to sail for Syria, he decided to go back through Macedonia. He was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus from Berea, Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, and Timothy also, and Tychicus and Trophimus from the province of Asia. These men went on ahead and waited for us at Troas. But we sailed from Philippi after the feast of unleavened bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the 3rd story and was picked up dead. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "He's alive." Then he went upstairs again and broke bread and ate. After talking until daylight, he left. The people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. So after this riot, Paul didn't leave Ephesus immediately. He spent some time with the disciples. He didn't abandon them. He spent some time with them. And things settled down, and then he decided to make the trip to Macedonia. Or maybe they had already made the decision to make the trip to Macedonia. It had been decided beforehand. That's, if you read Acts chapter 19 from verses 21 to 22, he had sent Timothy and Erastus ahead of him. So he was delayed. He spent a bit more time in Ephesus, settled things down, and then moved over to Macedonia. And again, it seems like it was the sense that it was time up in Ephesus, and he had already begun to feel that way, that he needed to move on. But I think the riot then confirmed that the atmosphere had changed, and it was time to move on to the next thing. And it's notable, I want to just say this again from last time, it's notable that the officials are the ones who defended Paul and his companions by pointing out that they had not stolen anything or spoken against the goddess Artemis. So it's a very interesting thing that he doesn't go out and come against Artemis and utter all kinds of things against the god who was controlling that area of Ephesus. Instead, what he did do is, the wisdom that he did is he did not aggressively go for the local religion to preach the word. You find, he does talk about idols, that you should not be worshipping idols made by human hands. But that's as far as he goes, and that they are not gods. That's as far as he goes. You don't see him directly attacking Zeus or Artemis or any of Hermes or any of the gods that are in that area. He does not do that. It seems the strategy involved focusing primarily on Christ, and not only focusing on Christ, but to find moral and ethical connections with what is there already. So he would, if it's in Athens, he begins to talk about their religion and how it is that they've got an altar to an unknown god, and then that is the point of connection from which he begins to talk. And in this instance, we find that while he was in Ephesus for all these years, he does not speak against the goddess. And what then happens is the people even in there are able to defend him, that he hasn't done any of the things against the goddess Artemis or Diana. So what we need to understand when we preach the gospel is that the law of God is written on people's hearts. God is already working, is already speaking to their consciences. Killing, adultery, stealing, wishing well on people, not being covetous and malicious, and so on. As we talk, not killing, not committing adultery, not stealing, and things like that. As we do that, and as we teach and model that, you find that people begin to see that this is the right way. When we do have issues of this nature and sin of this nature, people will turn away from whatever you're offering. Even if it's Christianity, if you find that the moral fiber has been lost in the Christian message, people will turn away from that Christian message. So what Paul does is he goes for the ethical and moral fiber, the higher things that God has put in the heart of every human being. We are created in the image of God, and there's something within us that wants to go back to who we were created to be. Then what Paul does is, what Luke does is he moves on and he begins to talk about Macedonia and Greece. The time that Paul went through Macedonia and then through Greece. It's in 2 verses that Luke covers these months, which might even have been a year, where he was in this area of Macedonia and Greece. So that would be, Macedonia would be the area of Philippi, Thessalonica, if he managed to get back in there, and Berea, and amongst others. It also seems he went over through to a place called Illyricum at this time. That is where Albania, modern day Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia. That's the area of Illyricum, where I'll be reading that towards the end of this session, because he writes the book of Romans while he's in Corinth, and he mentions this place called Illyricum, which there's no other mention of it in the book of Acts, but in the book of Romans it's mentioned, and it seems that it was one of the areas that he went to, because it was in the area of Macedonia, or just above Macedonia, where you find this place. So Paul's ministry seems to also have had a prophetic element. Why do I say that? Because you always hear he was encouraging and exhorting the believers. He encourages, he exhorts. So they go from Macedonia to Greece. Greece is a synonym, another word or another way of saying Achaia is the same area. And that would also mean that we're talking about the place of Corinth, that he went back to Corinth. So though God had preserved Paul in Corinth, we see that there was something that was happening. There was a plan afoot while he was in Corinth to do harm to him. He intended to go from Corinth go back directly to Syria from Corinth by ship. But then he discovered that there was a plan to kill him or to harm him while he was on the ship going back. And he decided not to go that route. He decided instead to go back through Macedonia and then to go back to go around that way. So what God sometimes does is he shows us what is about to happen, and so that our lives are preserved. And the forces of evil always have malicious plans towards God's leaders, always. So you need the Spirit's guidance step by step by step. God leading. And God showed Paul that there's this strategy against him, and they went a different direction. We get several travel companions that are mentioned here in the Acts, and the letters. We find there's a lot of travel companions that Paul is mentioned, always having people around him. It's amazing how many names you can pick up from Paul's letters and even this travel. Particularly here in Acts chapter 20, there's a lot of people who are accompanying him or who are around him that you see in this particular section. And it seems like they were representatives from different churches who were also going with this gift, or they had different gifts, so they had a collection that they were taking from the different parts or the Gentile world that they were taking to Jerusalem. And it seems like these men were the representatives of the churches from which the collections were coming. So he was also strategic in sharing his life with younger believers. And he had planted churches in there. They were going back to Jerusalem together. And it seems he wrote the book of Romans while he was there in Corinth. Let me read Romans chapter 15, verses 19 to 29 to give you a feel of what I'm saying here. And some of why we think that the book was written while he was in Corinth. So from Jerusalem all the way to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. It has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. Rather, as it is written, those who are not told about him will see, and those who have not yet or who have not heard will understand. This is why I have often been hindered from coming to you. Already there was a gospel in Rome, and he went to other places where the gospel had not been preached. That's what he's basically saying there. But then verse 23, but now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, and since I have been longing for many years to visit you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there after I've enjoyed your company for a while. Now, however, I'm on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the Lord's people there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the Lord's people in Jerusalem. They were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have shared in the Jews' spiritual blessings, they owe it to the Jews to share with them their material blessings. So after I've completed this task and have made sure that they have received this contribution, I will go to Spain and visit you on the way. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the full measure of the blessing of Christ. So the book of Romans was actually a preparation for an intended trip. He intended, after Jerusalem, to make a trip to go through Rome to to Spain. Now, we are never told that he actually did manage to get to Spain, but that was his intention, as you can see in this letter in the book of Romans. His intention was to go to Rome and then, go to Rome and then to Spain. But of course, he got arrested while he was in Jerusalem. He did get to Rome, but it was as a prisoner. And that's how the book of Acts actually ends. So we are getting into that journey into Jerusalem soon. But let me just close off by touching on this story of Eutychus. The first thing to note about Eutychus is that it was probably on a Sunday that Paul was preaching. The first day of the week, probably Sunday, and in a Gentile area, and also they use midnight as the demarcation of a new day. So it looks like, he's not using the Jewish calendar, which would start at 6 p.m. And 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. as the evening. But the demarcation of the new day would be 12 midnight. So that's an interesting fact, and that's something to see, that he's probably talking about Sunday, which means that people were beginning to already meet on the Lord's Day, even during Paul's time. Because there's this argument that people, Seventh-day Adventists especially, that people didn't meet on Sunday in the biblical times. Well, here's a scripture that shows you clearly that they did. And many lamps could suck oxygen. That's another notable thing that you need to see. It mentions just in passing, there were many lamps in the room. And if a room with quite a lot of people in it and with lamps, it would become an environment that can make you very drowsy. And that seems to be why Eutychus was then sitting by the window to try to get some air, probably because the room was a bit, crowded, and there's these lamps, and he wanted some oxygen. But of course, he was overcome by the drowsiness, and he ended up falling and dying. Now, he died. Paul prayed for him, and then he says, no, he's not dead, and so on. But Luke does say that the man had died. And what I believe, this is just an amazing thing, that Paul actually prays for someone who is dead, that God would raise him back. If you can imagine that meeting at Troas, the last time he's meeting with these guys, this is the thing that they remember, that somebody died while he was there. And I think, I don't know what he prayed, but he must have cried out to God that we cannot live with this as the final memory that these people would have. And he was praying in alignment with God's purposes and partnership with him. And the memory they then had was Eutychus was raised from the dead, and they broke bread. They had the Lord's Supper together, and he continued to preach until morning. That's the memory that they then had, that the message continued until morning. Everyone rejoiced, and everyone came out of the meeting in triumph and victory. So this is just a challenge that we should be praying, even dare to pray for people to be raised from the dead in some instances. You are blessed, and continue in God's blessing and favor.